Okay, so the next part of this module is about other communications that may be asked by the successor auditor from the predecessor auditor, as well as how this information gathered by the successor auditor from the predecessor auditor will be used in accepting the audit or during the course of the performance of the audit engagement. Okay, so the successor auditor should or can request from the client to authorize the predecessor auditor to allow him also to review the working papers, okay, that is used or has been gathered or has been produced by the predecessor auditor from his previous audit engagement. Okay, so the working papers will serve as the audit evidence. Okay, and this information can also give the successor auditor the idea of any misunderstanding between the client and the predecessor auditor, okay, and other things which he may consider in accepting or even during the conduct of his audit. Okay, so the predecessor auditor may also wish to request a consent and acknowledgment letter from the client to document this authorization. Okay, so this is done to reduce any misunderstanding with the scope of the communications being authorized. So this is very important because consent or the acknowledgement letter which contains the management or the client's consent and the scope of the information which the successor auditor can get from the predecessor auditor is important, so that if there is any misunderstanding where the management intends not to share a part of the information, so they can look into the acknowledgement letter if indeed that is being limited or not. Okay, so again, this is done to reduce any misunderstanding as to the scope of the communications being authorized to the predecessor auditor of any information that he may disclose to the successor auditor. So it is customary in such circumstances for the predecessor auditor to make himself or herself available to the successor auditor and also to make available for review certain of his or her working papers. Okay, so here, once the consent and authority has been given by the entity, so the communication can start, okay, between the successor and the predecessor auditor. So if that is allowed, then the predecessor auditor should make himself or herself available, as well as the review of certain of his or her working papers. So the predecessor auditor should determine also which working papers will be made available for review and which may be copied, because in this case, not everything, okay, that is discovered or gathered by the predecessor auditor can be made available to the successor auditor. So again, it can be limited by the consent of the entity, or it may be that based on the assessment of the predecessor auditor, it is not relevant, or some of the working papers are not relevant to the understanding of the successor auditor. Okay, so the predecessor auditor should ordinarily permit the successor auditor to review, as mentioned, okay, some of the working papers. This will include documentation of the planning, internal control, the audit results, other matters of continuing accounting and auditing significance, such as the working papers that contains the analysis of balance sheet, okay, accounts, or those relating to contingencies, related parties, and any other significant unusual transactions. So these are the information that can be provided by the predecessor auditor to the successor auditor. So also, the predecessor auditor should reach an understanding with the successor auditor as to the use, meaning after the predecessor auditor have disclosed the inquiries or the information requested by the successor auditor, they should also discuss and make an understanding of the extent of how this information will be used by the successor auditor. Okay, so the extent, if any, to which a predecessor auditor permits access to the working papers is also a matter of his judgment, as mentioned, because this will be assessed by the predecessor auditor if these working papers or information will be relevant, okay, to the understanding and decision of the successor auditor. So those are for the other communications. So in this video lecture, we will proceed with the use of the communications or the data or information gathered by the successor auditor from the predecessor auditor. Okay, so how this information will be used by the successor auditor. Okay, so here, the successor auditor must obtain sufficient appropriate evidential matter to afford a reasonable basis for expressing his opinion about the FS, okay, in which he or she is engaged to audit, including the evaluation of the consistency of the application of the accounting principles. Okay, so this is one of the most important reasons why the successor auditor requests, okay, information from the predecessor auditor. But basically, again, that is being used for his or her decision to accept or reject the audit engagement. So after that, he can also use the working papers, especially during the course of his audit. Okay, so the audit evidence used in analyzing the impact on the balances, okay, especially opening balances. These are the closing balances of the predecessor auditors, and this will now become the opening balances for the successor auditor. Okay, he will analyze those evidences, and the successor auditor will also determine if there is consistency of the application of the accounting principles based on the data. So such audit evidence may include, of course, the most recent audited FS. This was audited by the predecessor auditor. Second is the report also of the predecessor auditor. So what is his opinion regarding the FS of the client for the previous year? Okay. Another is the result of his inquiry. This will also add to the audit evidence. Another is the result of the successor auditor's review of the predecessor's working papers. Okay, so related to the most recently completed audited FS. Another is audit procedures performed on the current period's transactions that may provide evidence also about the opening balances or its consistency, because there are some transactions that might have occurred after the report of the predecessor auditors that has an impact on the opening balances of the accounts. So this is also important to consider, okay, by the successor auditor. Okay, so for example, audit evidence gathered during the current year's audit may provide information about the realizability and existence of the receivables and inventory that was recorded in the beginning of the year. So there might have been any transactions that has a great impact on this account balances. So it will also be considered by the successor auditor. So the successor auditor may also apply appropriate audit procedures to account for those balances, especially at the beginning of the period, okay, which is under his audit, and to the transactions that was that has occurred in the prior periods that might also have the effect on the current balances of the accounts. So the successor auditor, his review of the predecessor auditor's working paper may also affect the nature, timing, and extent of the successor auditor's procedures with the opening balances. And that may also be related to the consistency of the application of the accounting principles. So that's how useful is the communication between the predecessor and successor auditors. Okay. So, however, the nature, timing, and extent of the audit work that is performed and the conclusions reached in both of these areas are solely now the responsibility of the successor auditor, because the previous period has already been audited by the predecessor auditor and he has already expressed his opinion about it, okay, or the audit has been closed for the previous audit. So whatever the audit procedures and the audit evidence that the successor auditor may be gathered, even considering those information from the predecessor auditor, that is now fully and solely is the responsibility of the successor auditor, because he is now the new auditor for this current period. So in reporting on the audit, the successor auditor should not make reference to the work of the predecessor auditor as the basis for his own opinion. So in this case, he will use the data only to assist him on how he will plan and conduct the audit, but it cannot be used as a basis for the successor auditor's own opinion. Please take note of that. Okay, again, the information gathered by the successor auditor from the predecessor auditor cannot be used as a basis for the successor's own, or for the successor's auditor's own opinion. Okay, so again, he can use the information from the predecessor auditor to assist him in planning and performing certain audit procedures, but he cannot make it as a basis for his own opinion. Okay, so that is for the other in communication, as well as the successor auditor's use of these communications.